and welcome to the Planet of Horror, where we cover your worst nightmares. I'm your host Kate, and this week I wanted to cover a case I'd stumbled across and just had to dive deeper into. The case of a scientist that spent his whole life studying psychopaths to accidentally discover he was one. This scientist's name was James Fallon, and today we will be covering his story of how he discovered he was a psychopath and a little bit of basic explanation on what makes up a psychopath genetically. This episode will go deep. I think this case is a perfect example of nature versus nurture. So strap in, grab yourself a drink and or snack, and I'd say relax, but this honestly had me thinking for days, so good luck with that. And without further ado, I will dive into it. In October 2005, neuroscientist James Fallon was looking at brain scans of psychopathic murderers. You see, James had studied brain scans of dangerous people for decades. His academic career was centred around the study of human behaviour and what the brain and genetic makeup looked like for someone with said behaviours. Outside of his academic research, James also analysed brain scans for upcoming trials for people claiming diminished responsibility for their crimes. These people, he said, were the worst of the worst, doing the most horrific crimes, but due to confidentiality, he has not given any examples of these cases. So that October afternoon, James had a pile of brain scans he was going through and writing up analyses on, some from lawyers, some from other academics, and the brain scans themselves were of loads of different people with loads of different types of disorders. James had recognised a pattern in the brains of psychopathic killers, and so he was writing a paper on this pattern. He was putting his finishing touches on it that night, before turning his attention to one of his other research projects. Out of pure serendipity, James was also doing a study on Alzheimer's, and as part of that study, he had acquired brain scans from himself and all of his family, as he needed more people in the study, and he needed it quickly, so who better to volunteer? His wife also had a history of Alzheimer's, so by volunteering she thought it would help their children. One of the lab technicians had brought his family's scans into him that night, so when he turned his attention to his next project and he was looking through his family's scans, everything seemed normal until he got to the last scan and he looked at it very oddly. He noticed something was wrong. The scan showed low activity in certain areas of the frontal and temporal lobes, linked to empathy, morality, and self-control. Thinking it was a prank, he started to question the lab technicians. Did you put one of the psychopathic brains in with my family's scans? Haha, very funny. But they would assure him they didn't do that those scans were 100% his family. James would reply, whoever this was shouldn't be walking free. They had a very dangerous brain. So James broke the code of his study, which was that it was a blind study. He wasn't meant to know whose scans was whose. But James peeled back the sticker covering the personal information, and to his horror, it was his own brain scan. So James is sat there, and he's looking at his scan, and he's thinking, he knows he's not a dangerous murderer. This theory must be wrong, or the scan is. At this time, he's pretty much dismissing it. He's very busy at work and he has a lot of deadlines to meet, and he doesn't really think about it much. A while later, however, James got the genetic test results back from his family as well, and the pattern was the same. His family all relatively normal, but when it came to his data, you would think he was a psychopathic murderer and he should be locked away forever. A disclaimer here, before we go any further. that genetics is a very complicated field of study, and I'm not a scientist myself, so this explanation is going to be very simplified. And if you want a more in-depth one, I suggest you can search YouTube for genetic explanations. So yeah, just to pre-warn you, I'm not a scientist myself, so this is based on research that I've done and how I understand it. James's genetics showed he had all of the high acting level genes, which he referred to as warrior genes. Genes that are linked to our behaviours. For each warrior gene, we're said to have about 15 other genes that regulate it. These regulators come in different forms. Physically, they are long or short. How they act is high or low. So these high or low regulators make sure our behaviours are in context to the situation we are in. For example, two people with aggressive genes are in an argument. A person with high regulators may be overly angry to the situation and start yelling, while a person with low regulators will also get angry, but they won't have such an extreme reaction. When we are born, it's like a lottery of which few of these warrior genes we will get, but most people's genetic data show you will get a few high acting level genes and a few low acting level genes, balancing out a person. You're not guaranteed to get aggressive genes at all. Some people don't. And some people, like James, get all of them. It's very improbable, but it's not impossible. On top of this, James' scans also showed he had all of the genes linked to low emotional empathy and high cognitive function. Altogether, his genetic data showed statistically he should be a very violent, very smart person with low anxiety and no ability to empathise with anyone else. The perfect recipe for a psychopathic murderer. But James wasn't one. At this point, James had to accept, at least scientifically, his brain scans and genetics did match a psychopath's. He accepted the results were not an error, and he trusted his theory on what genetics and brain patterns made up a psychopathic killer. But he did not really believe in himself that he was a psychopath. You could see this as denial, or James not really caring that much, because he doesn't really seem to try to go any deeper into this. It's more people pushing him. When James was asked to do a TED talk on genetics, and he'd mentioned this story, this was perfect for them, and they could market this very well. A scientist that studies psychopaths that turns out to be a psychopath himself, it's a pretty incredible story. So James agreed. He agreed to give his story, and it almost made him famous, both in the academic world and online. It wasn't long before he was contacted by Simon Mirren, who was the writer/producer for a show called Criminal Minds. They had James star in the 100th episode, giving a talk. Since then, the two of them have become very good friends, and James would help out giving advice on some of their episodes, which I love that show, to be fair, and always thought they got the psychological angle better than most, and this is probably why. In 2010, James was offered a book deal and was asked to do a talk at the University of Oslo in Norway with the ex-Prime Minister. The ex-Prime Minister had just been diagnosed with bipolar and was giving a talk on his personal story. James was impressed by the bravery of a North European who is in politics admitting he was mentally ill. James agreed to do the talk with him. James's part of the talk was explaining how bipolar, along with other disorders, are diagnosed through genetics and brain scans. It's worth a note here, though, that James wasn't moved, he was impressed, which, in the language he chose to use, does show a lack of empathy. He's not emotionally connecting, he's impressed by his bravery. During this talk, James needed to use examples as visual aids, and ethically he could only really use his own data, and so he did. At the end of the talk, the head of psychiatry at the university gave his clinical opinion on James's data, saying he thought he was bipolar and he was just up all the time, which people don't necessarily have to have lows, but it was something James hadn't been told before. He had been told he was hypomanic, which is a behaviour in bipolar. It was an interesting point, and it got James thinking. Later in the evening, he was at a reception at the president of the university's house. All of these highly educated, highly intelligent people, all in the field of psychology in some manner, are sat around chatting and drinking. At the end of the night, they told him, "You probably don't realise this, but you're right on the border of being a psychopath." And this was the first time James had taken it seriously. And from this, he went on and he asked people in his life what they really thought of him. He was trying to find out if there was something he doesn't see. And they all told him the same thing, that he does do these psychopathic things, but he never seemed dangerous as a person. No one was scared of him. But this surprised him. And it honestly surprised me that it took him this long to become interested in himself. Like, if you consider he had these brain scans since 2005, and it's now 2010 before he's like, oh, like, I really want to look in if I am really a psychopath. Like, you would think you would have to find that out earlier than now. Now James had more questions than ever. What did this mean? Because he wasn't a violent person. He didn't feel the need to kill anyone. Overall, he led a pretty normal life. He had a good upbringing. He met his wife at a very young age and they'd always been together. He had a good career. He had kids and now grandkids. If he had all of these predetermined biological traits, why didn't he become a psychopathic killer? During 2011 and 2012, 2 papers came out about epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how behaviours and environment can cause changes that affect the way our genetics work. These papers suggested if a person experienced high stress or trauma during their developing years of 0 to 3, it would cause their regulator genes to change, and instead of simply making the warrior gene high or low acting, it would make it always on instead, meaning a person would lose context to their behaviours. If you think about it, all behaviours are normal given the right context. It's okay to murder someone if they're trying to murder you and your family and you're trying to protect yourself. It's not okay to simply want to murder someone. If a person makes you mad, you get mad. But someone with these epigenetic markers would just be mad all of the time, no matter the situation. It would always be on. It may not be related to anger or violence though, because not everybody has those warrior genes. It really depends on what genetics you were born with. This is purely in the context of psychopathic murderers. A person that is already born at a genetic disadvantage like James, who had all the high-acting aggressive genes, will almost 100% become a psychopath if they experience trauma during those developing years. So, by their theory, James did not experience any trauma, and so he never developed any of those epigenetic markers, and this is why his biological data looks the way it does. He was never tipped over the edge, so to speak. James still has psychopathic traits, because he still has low emotional empathy. James would always come across as cold or uncaring when he's not consciously trying, as he simply doesn't feel it. but that doesn't have to mean a person is a bad person. It seems that is created by the environment. So let's look at James's environment. James was raised in a very good environment. His parents were very well educated, and when he reflects on his life, he only has happy, loving memories of his family. He actually asked his mother about how he was in his childhood, and she would admit she was very worried about him during his puberty years. He seemed very dark, and she actually went to his school and asked all of his teachers to keep him busy. During school, James actually played for 4 different sports teams, all high contact sports too, things like football and wrestling. And if he wasn't playing sports, he was involved in the arts, playing music or acting. His mother would say when he was bored, that meant trouble. And not trouble in the context of like violent behaviour. James himself would say, he did little naughty things, but never to like an extreme point. He was never arrested. He never had a criminal record or anything like that. James was actually analysed by 2 psychiatrists not long after 2012, and it was found James had a lot of similar behaviours, thoughts, urges and drives as a fully fledged psychopath. He just never acted them out, and they think this is because he had a very well developed upper part of his frontal cortex that suppressed it all. So I can imagine that unlike a fully formed psychopath, James's psychopathic urges were like intrusive thoughts that passed. And he thinks this is because from a young age he was always kept busy. He always had outlets for his urges and fixes for his drives. He does say he's very competitive and he does have the drive to win at any costs. But he also says his entire family is like that, and overall that's about the most dangerous thing about him, that he's very annoying to play board games with. So that was the story of James Fallon. Incredibly interesting, right? A scientist that spends his entire life studying psychopaths and doesn't really ever look inwards on himself to discover that he himself is a psychopath. Like he says at some points during interviews that he never really considered that his thoughts were psychopathic. He just thought everybody thinks this way, which, is understandable for a normal person, but you would think somebody that is studying these genetic markers all the time would take interest in the way you work yourself. Or, to be fair, maybe I'm the weird one, because I do self-analyse my behaviour like an awful lot. My final thoughts on this case is that it really shows it's not as simple as nature versus nurture. When it comes to these monsters, it's very much equally both. A person can be born at a genetic disadvantage, yes, but it doesn't make the person destined to be a bad person. That is created by the environment, the way they grow up during their developing years. And that's not saying that it's always the parents' fault, because James was very fortunate. He had a family that did seem to pay a lot of attention to his development, and they were very knowledgeable in how to help. Not everyone is. And then there are things in life that we just can't control as families, like bullying, which is a very big theme in the young lives of a lot of serial killers. You can YouTube James Fallon to listen and watch some of his TED Talks. He's a very interesting man and explains the actual science a lot better than me. So if you want to check him out, I'll leave some of his videos linked below. Also, make sure to check out the book he wrote, Inside the Mind of a Psychopathic Killer, which I would highly recommend. You can find it on Amazon, and I will also have that linked below. Make sure to subscribe and click that bell notification so you'll know the next time I release a story. And that being said, I hope you have a good day or rest of your evening. Over and out.